Hi, my name is jObBy, and children's card games have ruined my life. Where do I even begin with Magic the Gathering? Never in my 84 years of living did I ever think I would get into a trading card game, let alone the trading card game. The goal of the game is to get your opponent's life total to 0, and you do that by casting spells, but in order to cast spells, you need mana, and already this doesn't make any sense. This won't be much of a Magic tutorial. If you really wanted to know how to play the game, I highly recommend playing Magic the Gathering Arena. This video more so exists for the sole purpose to make my cards a tax write-off, to flex my deck a little bit. And I gotta get it out of the way, I am not sponsored by Wizards of the Coast. I wish I was. But thanks to the actual sponsor of this video, Surfshark VPN. Browsing the web with a virtual private network allows you to surf while knowing all your important stuff is private, secure, and protected. Like your emails, your passwords, your Black Friday purchases. But Surfshark does way more than protect your privacy. You can virtually travel the world by changing your IP address. You have a choice of over 3,200 servers in over 100 countries. Use that to get better deals online. Some stores change their prices depending on where you're shopping from. Or you could use Surfshark to watch region-locked content on Netflix. Did you know that Godzilla 1990 Peak is on Netflix? But not for America. But just switch your location to any of these countries, and that's a lot of fish. Surfshark VPN also includes Surfshark Alert, letting you know when your sensitive information's been compromised in any way. It's available to download on iOS, Android, Mac, Windows, Linux, just about everything. So check the link in the description for an exclusive Black Friday deal, and use my promo code jObBy for an extra 5 months free. But if for some reason you're not satisfied with your privacy, why wouldn't you be? There's a 30-day money-back guarantee. And today we're gonna be talking about my Gishath Sun's Avatar Commander deck. So that's 99 cards plus 1 commander. But in this particular deck, I run a companion, and again, this isn't gonna make much sense. Just let me have this, alright? I've been through a lot these past few months. Gishath Sun's Avatar, a full dinosaur tribal deck, which just means that all the creatures that I run here are all dinosaurs. And some of them are some very special dinosaurs. I tell ya, I never thought a piece of cardboard could get me this excited. But before we get balls deep with this deck, let's get right into the 2 key pieces here. And for the sake of transparency, I will be including the price of each card. You are obligated to make fun of me. To kick off this deck tech video, as the community calls it, let's talk about the main man himself, the Commander. And by the way, Commander's just the format of Magic the Gathering. The most popular format, as far as I know, super casual multiplayer Gishath Sun's Avatar, which I bought for a stupid price, which I should have waited for it to go down. This big beefy boy costs 5 generic, 1 red, 1 green, 1 white. It's a legendary creature dinosaur avatar, and it's got Trample, Vigilance, Haste. Oh my goodness, I just dropped a bunch of concepts that you guys don't know. So first of all, the casting cost. In the game of Magic, in order to cast any of these spells, you need to put down something called a land, and each land comes in different colors. 5 colors in total, I believe. There's red, green, white, black, and blue. I forget about blue because I fucking hate blue. And on each of your turns, you get to play 1 land. And in order to pay a certain color, you tap that land for mana. And mana is the resource that you use to cast your spells. You tap lands for mana. Does that make sense? Please leave your comments down below about how I sound like a crazy person. So in Gishath's case, in order to get his big butt into play, I need to have 1 red land, 1 green land, and 1 white land on the field. And I would have to tap all of them for mana. But that's not all. There's that gray number 5 there, which is an additional cost that I can pay with any color of mana. It just has to be 5 of them. So in total, the mana value of this card is 8. Now that might not sound like much to the uninitiated, but if we take into consideration that you're allowed 1 land per turn, theoretically, I would need 8 turns to get this guy out. But as you'll see in this deck, if you're still watching, I have ways to get more than 1 land per turn into play. But anyway, that is the foundation of the game. If you got no land, you got no mana, you got no game. So to dissect the card even further, we'll go to this little type line here. This guy is a legendary creature and a dinosaur avatar. The legendary thing is important. Only legendary creatures are allowed to be your commander. And what a commander is a card that you'll have off to the side in a place where we call the command zone. If this thing were to die on the field, which he will a lot, instead of going to your graveyard, he goes into your command zone. And I don't have to explain the graveyard, right? That's just the discard pile or Yu-Gi-Oh! You just have essentially a card that you always have access to. Theoretically. Every time your commander goes back into the command zone, it will cost 2 additional generic mana, which is that gray number symbol, to cast. So the first time I cast this guy, I can cast him for 8, 5 generic, 1 red, 1 green, 1 white. But if he dies and I want to cast him from the command zone, he will cost 1 red, 1 green, 1 white, and 7 generic mana. And let me tell you, at a certain point, it gets really hard to pay your taxes. #real. This concept is actually called the commander tax. That's what a commander is. So now let's get into the meat of the card, the description, which you could actually find my deck in. Shoutouts to Archidect, not sponsored, but a really great website for deck building. Trample, Vigilance, Haste. What does it all mean? Let's go with Trample first. So combat in the game of Magic. Like I mentioned before, the goal of the game is to get your opponent's life total to 0. You start off with 40 points in Commander. Say I've got Gishath on the field and my opponent has this Scytheclaw Raptor. Now, on my turn, I am able to declare an attacker, and unlike a lot of TCGs, you can't direct an attacker to a specific creature. It always has to go to another player. And let's say I'm directing Gishath at my opponent. My opponent, with their 1 creature here, has the ability to block, as long as they got a creature on their field and it's not tapped. And we'll get more into tapping, untapping later. I kind of already mentioned it with lands. So let's say my invisible opponent, you, I'm gonna strike at you. I'm in your wall. So let's say you declare this guy as a blocker for my Gishath. Both of these creatures would deal damage at the same time to each other. His power is at 7, and this guy's toughness is at 3, and toughness is just another word for the creature's health. So this guy has 3 health, this guy has 7 attack. If they were to attack, this guy would die. 7 is greater than 3, don't you know? But this trample effect is a bit special. If this guy did not have trample, they would clash, this guy would die, and my opponent would not take any damage. However, because of trample, excess damage, if you do the math, and there's a lot of math in this game, this guy would have done 4 excess damage to this creature. Trample just means that that excess damage goes to the opponent, and the opponent takes 4 damage. So trample is essentially just Yu-Gi-Oh, right? That's how Yu-Gi-Oh works. Excess damage goes to the opponent. That's it, which is excellent for the specific commander. We'll get into why in a bit after I talk about Vigilance and Haste. Vigilance first. Now, that whole combat thing. In most cases, now let's say that I'm controlling this Scytheclaw Raptor, and my opponent is controlling Gishath, God forbid, and now I'm going to declare this guy to attack this guy for some reason. Really bad tactical move. For most creatures in Magic, you must tap the creature in order to declare an attack. And remember how I said that in order to block an attacking creature, you have to have your creature untapped. So that's a big part of the strategy in the game, whether or not you want to attack somebody but lose a defender. However, with the keyword Vigilance here, you do not have to tap, which means this guy can attack and then block on the opponent's turn. Amazing. Vigilance is so good, and I believe Vigilance is more of a perk for white, and that's something I didn't even get into. Each color of Magic has a certain philosophy and playstyle associated with it. I myself am a red-green player, leaning more into green, but I like having white privilege. But anyway, next keyword that Gishath has, Haste. So to explain Haste, we have to go back to the concept of casting, like we discussed at length before. This guy cost 1 red, 1 green, 1 white, 5 generic mana. So I am just going to tap my lands to pay for it. 1 red, 1 green, 1 white, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 generic. And now I get to cast Gishath. For most creatures, on the turn that you cast a creature, they cannot attack. They say that the creature has some something called Summoning Sickness, which is also what you have when you get called into work. So Summoning Sickness, they can't do anything on the turn they're cast, but they can still block, which is good for you. However, if a creature has the keyword Haste, they can attack on the same turn that they are cast. So with all of those keywords explained, this guy is kind of stupid. Excess damage to an opponent, doesn't have to tap to attack, and can attack on the same turn that it's cast. God, I love this thing. But that's not even the best part. Whenever Gishath's son's avatar deals combat damage to a player, reveal that many cards from the top of your library. Put any number of dinosaur creature cards from among them onto the battlefield and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So, what does this mean? It means I'm gonna fucking come. Remember my combat explanation? Say you block with the Scytheclaw Raptor and I go ahead and do my damage. This thing dies and the opponent, if you remember, takes 4 excess damage. That means I get to reveal 4 cards from the top of my library, which is just another word for deck. And if there are any dinosaur cards among them, I get to put them on the field without that's not a dinosaur, without paying their mana cost. Depending on how much damage I do to a player, and depending on how much dinosaurs I include in the deck, Gishath can pop off. And the last thing to talk about is the power and toughness, which I've already discussed. So 7 power, so this guy hits for 7, and 6 toughness, which means you have to do 6 damage to this guy to kill it. So that's my commander, and hopefully now you guys have a grasp kind of how the game works. But anyway, the average Gishath deck, according to EDH Rec, run this deck without a companion. But I run a companion. Kaheera the Orphanguard costs 1 generic mana, and that symbol on the casting cost just means that you can cast her for either green or white. Legendary creature, a cat beast, and she has the keyword companion. What companion means, if you choose this card to be your companion, your deck has to follow a certain prerequisite. In this case, each creature in my deck has to be either all cats, all elementals, all nightmares, all dinosaurs, or all beasts. I assume it also means that I could run cats and dinosaurs in the same deck, which I'm not gonna do, but you guys tell me if you're Magic veterans. So because of everything I said about Gishath, that's super beneficial to me. I want all my creatures to be dinosaurs. But it also means that I lose access to a lot of dinosaur support cards that are not dinosaurs. A lot of humans in this category, which is really not a big deal for me because I hate humans. And yeah, there's a ton of different creature types, and it's super fun to make a tribal deck, which just means that all or the majority of your creatures are one creature type. This is a dinosaur tribal deck. Some people run dragon tribal, which is my first deck. Our very own Omar, aka Civil, runs a rat tribal, which is appropriate because he's a dirty fucking rat. But if you do choose to run a companion, this card will be on the side, kind of like the command zone, but not really, just outside of the game, let's say. The sideboard. And at any time during the game, you're allowed to pay 3 generic mana, so that's mana of any color, to put your companion into your hand. But you could only do it once per turn, only as a sorcery, which I'm sure we'll get into that terminology later. So that essentially makes this companion cost 6 total mana value to cast. That's 3 generic, and then 1 generic, and then the 2 colored symbols, which is worth casting because this creature herself has vigilance, which we got into, beautiful effect, but also gives all of your dinosaurs or cats or beasts or elementals or nightmares, all of them have vigilance as long as this thing is on the field. They also get +1/+1 to their power and toughness. So let's just imagine I hit with Gishath, ton of dinosaurs on the field, and then I cast Kaheera, the Orphanguard, my companion. That would mean all of these dinosaurs get +1/+1, and on the following turn, in order for them to attack, they don't have to tap, which means I just have an army that I could send out and block with at the same time. Amazing! But that also means this thing is super targetable, and if you get rid of this, all of my dinosaurs lose that effect. And why am I saying this out loud? And yeah, I know I said you can't attack a creature directly, but there are other ways to target creatures directly. Love this thing as an option. As long as it's not targeted, it's a great buff for my entire deck. So these are the 2 key pieces of my deck. And now, after 2 freaking hours and hopefully a tenuous grasp on the game, we will get into the deck itself. Again, you can find my deck in the description on archadeck.com. Feel free to leave a comment on the deck. Feel free to make suggestions because I've only been playing the game for about 2 months. I can always learn more about the game. Feel free to backseat deck build is what I'm saying. Think now would be a good time for a break. I'm gonna go have lunch and wonder where my life went wrong. So, 99 cards plus my commander and companion. I've separated them into several categories, and I put some D20s on them just to remind myself of how much of each category I have. So over here, we have our lands, 38 in total, 13 sorceries, 4 artifacts, 7 instants, 5 enchantments, and the main focus of the deck, 32 creatures. So, I think it's only fair to begin with the creatures, starting at King of the Monsters himself, Godzilla. One of the first cards I bought for obvious reasons. And this is actually a reskin of an existing dinosaur creature. Zilortha, Strength Incarnate, not nearly as cool as Godzilla himself. 3 generic, 1 red, 1 green. He's a legendary creature, a dinosaur, which means he can be a commander. I tried to build a deck around Godzilla, but not nearly as fun to play as Gishath. And he has Trample, and it says, lethal damage dealt to creatures you control is determined by their power rather than their toughness. So you see that Godzilla here has 7 power and 3 toughness. So in normal cases, you would have to do 3 damage to kill this guy. But because of Godzilla's effect, you have to do 7. Pretty straightforward and really helpful for creatures that have low toughness but high power. But in other cases, kind of messes with some of my creatures. Say for instance, my Runic Armasaur, who's only got 2 power and 5 toughness. Now without Godzilla on the field, this guy would be a great blocker because I could just block with this guy and most of my opponent's creatures don't do 5 damage. But if Godzilla was on the field, they would only have to do 2 damage and he would die. While Godzilla is such a beautiful looking card and it's Godzilla, how could I not have him in the deck? Gameplay wise, not my favorite. But on the topic of that other guy, Runic Armasaur. 1 generic, 2 green. Not a legendary creature, just a dinosaur. Whenever an opponent activates an ability of a creature or land that isn't a mana ability, you may draw a card. Bit of a word salad there, but I will do my best to make it make sense. If we take this land here, Canopy Vista, really nice Lord of the Rings themed card. It has an activated ability saying tap for green or white mana. That would be an activated mana ability. It's an ability that produces mana. So if an opponent were to tap this and activate that ability, this guy would not trigger. I would not be able to draw a card. However, say we take this other land, Ghost Quarter. Sure, it has an activated ability of tap for colorless mana, which you can pay colorless cost, of course. It has another activated ability that says tap it and sacrifice it to destroy target land, which on a side note is really mean to do. Most of my playgroup doesn't run land destruction, but sometimes if you have a Maze of If that prevents all combat damage, you know who the fuck you are. You want to destroy lands. But anyway, if one of my opponents were to activate that ability, not a mana ability, Runic Armasaur's ability would trigger. I would be able to draw a card, and let me tell ya, draw power in this game is incredibly useful. Depending on the deck you're running, you don't want to run out of gas, as they say, which means your hand is empty, you've played everything you have, and you're just top decking, just waiting, praying that you get a card from the top of your deck that will be useful to you in the moment. So draw power, really great. It's just more options for you in the game. Just to give you another example of activated abilities on creatures, not lands, here we have Zacama, Primal Calamity. And this guy has 3 activated abilities that you can pay for, and none of them produce mana. So if an opponent had this card, God forbid, and they activated one of those abilities, I would be able to draw a card from this guy. Let's move on to our next one, which will be Zacama, Primal Calamity. I absolutely love this card. I mean, first of all, it's a 3-headed dinosaur, looks awesome, but it's also extremely expensive. And I don't mean financially. 6 generic mana, 1 red, 1 green, 1 white. Woof! Has Vigilance, Reach, Trample. Oh, okay, so Vigilance and Trample, we've covered that with Gishath, but Reach is a new one. Reach deals with flying creatures, so there are going to be some creatures that have the keyword flying. And what flying does is that they cannot be blocked by any creatures without flying. So if you got flying and no one else has flying creatures, they're fucked. They can't block. You pretty much win. However, there are some things here that have Reach, and Reach are non-flying creatures that can block flying. And this guy has, when Zacama Primal Calamity enters the battlefield, if I cast it, untap all lands I control. Say, for instance, Jesus Christ, look at how much land that is. Tapping all of this stuff will bring out Zacama. If I do that, if I pay for the cost, because that is the definition of casting in this game, you have to pay the cost in order to cast something, unless noted otherwise, but we'll get to that later. If I cast it, that would mean all of my lands untap, and then I can use them again to pay for anything else, which essentially means if I have the mana for him, I can play him for free. Those activated abilities that I mentioned, I mean, there's just a lot of utility here. If you pay 2 generic and 1 red mana, it deals 3 damage to target creature. The second activated ability, you got 2 generic, 1 green mana. It destroys target artifact or enchantment, a core part of the game that we'll get into later. And the final one, 2 generic, 1 white mana, you gain 3 life. Love this card, but a big downside to it is that it doesn't really synergize with Gishath. If I trigger this guy's ability, we do the whole song and dance of revealing the cards and putting them on the field. If I revealed this guy and put him on the field for free, I didn't cast it. I just put him on the field for free. They're 2 distinct things. Magic cards are super specific with their terminology. So that is Zacama. All right, next up we got Topiary Stomper. Lovely card as well. It's a plant dinosaur, costs 1 generic and 2 green. Bit on the cheap side, which is excellent in the early game. He has Vigilance, but also when Topiary Stomper enters the battlefield, search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. Topiary Stomper can't attack or block unless you control 7 or more lands. This card is a great introduction to the concept of ramp. For each of every player's turn, they have the privilege of playing 1 land. However, if I had Topiary Stomper in my hand, I could pay 2 green, 1 generic, bring him out onto the field, and his effect is that I can search the rest of my deck for a basic land card, which is just one of these. I mean, you saw 3 of them. I can search for one of those, put that onto the battlefield, and then shuffle, which essentially means an extra land that I'm able to play during my turn legally. Amazing. Ramping up, that's what we call it, because you want to ramp ahead of your enemies in terms of your land, and I have a lot more cards in my deck that do similar things like this. Here we have one of the new ones from the Lost Caverns of Ixalan set that just came out. Scytheclaw Raptor. 2 generic, 1 red. Whenever a player casts a spell, if it's not their turn, Scytheclaw Raptor deals 4 damage to them. This effect deals with something called Instants, which is one of the categories of spells that I have here in my deck. I have 7 instants, and what an instant is a spell that you could cast at any time, including on other people's turns. For an example here, Blessed Respite. 1 generic, 1 green. Target player shuffles their graveyard into their library. Prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn. Say, someone's got a whole army of creatures coming at me. I got nothing to block with, and I will die if I take all the damage that they're sending my way. It has happened before. If I had the mana available, say if I had the mana untapped, I could be like, oh, you're sending all that damage to me and you're gonna kill me in 1 move? Well, I've got mana open, 1 green, 1 generic, and I'm gonna cast Blessed Respite, which would mean that all of their damage that they were declaring on me would not go through. It would be prevented, and I casted the spell on their turn. I love the concept of instants. It could get really salty and sneaky, not to get too much into my instants quite yet. How it's relevant to this card, Scytheclaw Raptor, is if I had this guy on the field, whether or not I control it. If I casted that Blessed Respite and I had Scytheclaw Raptor on the field and I had 4 damage to go, my own creature would kill me. It's pretty much punishment for casting instants. Great protection, but gotta be really careful on my end as well. So this guy is a bit of a wild card. No pun intended. 4 power, 3 toughness would synergize really well with Godzilla. All right, next card. Ooh, introducing another mechanic here. Regal Behemoth. 4 generic, 2 green. Wasn't always a Triceratops and wasn't even always a dinosaur, but I really love this reprint here. He's got Trample. When he enters the battlefield, you become the Monarch. We have a card representing the Monarch status, but for the purposes of the game, this is not a card. It's just a representation of what you are, just for everyone's visual reference. Does that make sense? I don't even care anymore about making sense. Anyway, if you are the Monarch, you are able to draw a card during your end step. So at the end of your turn, you draw an extra card. Just for added context, at the beginning of every player's turn, they draw 1 card. That's pretty standard for card games and board games even, right? But the Monarch just allows you to draw an extra card, and as I mentioned before, draw power, super good in Magic. So you want to be the Monarch. But in Regal Behemoth's case, you really want to be the Monarch. Whenever you tap a land for mana while you're the Monarch, add an additional 1 mana of any color. So, although this isn't technically a land ramp spell like our Topiary Stomper, this still ramps us if we get him out early enough. What that effect means is that when this guy comes into play, and I'm the Monarch, I could tap 4 lands for 8 mana. So good, but very, very precarious, because you see, the Monarch status, whenever a player does combat damage to you, if you don't block it, if you take that damage, they become the Monarch instead. 5/5 creature, Regal Behemoth. Our next card here, Wayward Swordtooth. For 2 generic, 1 green. And he's got a mechanic called Ascend. If you control 10 or more permanents, you get the city's blessing for the rest of the game. The term permanent just means anything that stays on the field. Anything that's not an instant or a sorcery, which we'll get into later. So that means creatures, enchantments, artifacts, and lands. These are all what we call permanents. If you have 10 or more permanents, you get the city's blessing. And as long as this guy's on the field, you may play an additional land on your turn. So you remember how I said that every player has the privilege of playing 1 land per turn? With this guy, I get to play 2. An effective way of ramp. I get to cheat out another land. But it's not cheating if it's printed on this card, right? I swear all these cards are real. However, very similar to Topiary Stomper, this guy can't do anything unless you have 7 or more lands. This guy can't do anything unless you have 10 or more permanents. Not that big of a deal in this deck, because ideally, if we trigger Gishath's ability, you'll have a ton of creatures on the board and a ton of lands, more than 10 permanents, and then this guy could swing for 5 damage and block for 5 toughness. Wayward Swordtooth. Oh, okay. This is, a favorite at the table. Tyrranax Rex. Oh, I love this card, but it is kind of salty. 4 generic mana, 3 green mana. Pretty costly, but if I cheat him out with Gishath, oh boy, it could get nasty. Phyrexian dinosaur, which Phyrexians are an original race in the Magic the Gathering universe, but whatever. This spell can't be countered. This is only relevant if I were to cast them, and I've already made the distinction of casting a spell and putting a card onto the battlefield, right? And the idea of a counter is something really annoying, and you should never do it, and if you do counter spells, you're a bad person. But if you happen to play against a blue player, let's say that I pay 8, and then I declare to the rest of my group, hey guys, the commander's coming out, you're all gonna die. A blue player, you know who the fuck you are, if they have mana available as I'm casting the spell, they could be like, nope, counter spell. And what that means is that this does not even enter the battlefield. It just goes into the graveyard. Or in the commander's case, it would go back to the command zone. But still, being counterspelled is, it's one of the worst things that can happen to you as a Magic player. And I've gotten counterspelled a few times, and I don't know why I haven't dropped the game after that. However, this guy's effect, the Tyrranax Rex, it says it can't be countered. So if a blue player were to try that shit with Tyrranax Rex, they couldn't do it. This would go on the field regardless. Great protection for itself. It also has Trample, and he has Haste. Ward 4, though. It's the same type of font as a generic mana cost, and that's exactly what it is. Let's say, for instance, an opponent controls Zacama. They want to deal 3 damage to Tyrranax Rex. They would have to pay the mana cost for that ability for this guy, right? However, with that ward ability, they would also have to pay 4 extra generic mana to even do anything to this guy. So it's just more protection for himself. And everyone's favorite part, and admittedly a pretty scummy mechanic as well, Toxic 4. Players dealt combat damage by this creature also get 4 poison counters. Poison, it's just an alternate way of losing the game. If a player has 10 poison counters, they lose. Doesn't matter if their life point is not 0, they can be at 40 life points for all I care. If they got 10 poison counters, they're out. Dunzo. Theoretically, if this guy were to do damage to one player 3 times, they're out. It is quite a toxic card. And with that trample damage as well, if anyone was to block this creature, even if 1 point of damage from this guy went through, they would get 4 poison counters. Love this card. Kind of busted. Really mean, but I don't give a fuck anymore. You know, this isn't water. This is fucking pure vodka. Oof! Alright, we have another potentially salty card. Polyraptor. 6 generic mana, 2 green mana. It has an ability called Enrage. Whenever this guy is dealt damage, it creates a copy of itself. If you do enough damage to this guy, while not killing it of course, you can have a ton of Polyraptors on the field. And while a 5/5 might not seem like a lot, if you have 10 5/5s, that's 50 damage. And there is a way to get 10, 100, 1,000 Polyraptors onto the field. The Marauding Raptor. Really cheap to cast too. 1 generic, 1 red. Says creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. And that just means with this guy on the field, instead of my commander costing 5 generic and 1 red, 1 green, 1 white, it would cost 4 generic, 1 red, 1 green, 1 white. The price of having my creatures cost 1 generic less to cast, whenever a creature enters the battlefield, this guy will deal 2 damage to that creature. And if that creature happens to be a dinosaur, say my commander, this guy would get a +2 buff on his power. So instead of being a 2/3, it would now be a 4/3. Now these two work well together. So let's say my opponent takes the full 7 damage. I reveal 7 cards from the top of my deck. Let's say a bunch of them are dinosaurs. That would just mean that this guy will be doing 2 damage to each of them and getting +2, +2, +2 for each dinosaur that he does damage to. So potentially a really good combo here. An even better combo. Marauding Raptor and Polyraptor. You don't even win with this. You just end it. Let me explain. Polyraptor's ability. Whenever he's done damage, you create a copy of him. And that copy has all the same abilities as the original. This guy's on the field. I cast this guy. Marauding Raptor deals 2 damage to Polyraptor. Because he was dealt damage, he spawns a copy of himself. And because that copy enters the battlefield, the Marauding Raptor does 2 damage to the copy. And then that copy spawns another copy. And then that copy enters, and then this guy deals damage to that copy, and then that copy spawns another copy, and this guy deals damage to that copy, and that copy, the copy. Unless you have a way to break the loop, you end the game. And let me be clear, you don't win the game. You draw the game. You end it. No one wins, no one loses. It just stops because there's no way to stop this loop, as far as I know. Our next card, Ravenous Sailback for 4 generic, 1 green. When this guy enters the battlefield, I have 2 options. I get to destroy a target artifact or enchantment, or I can give this guy haste until the end of the turn. Really cool looking card, but a cooler Spinosaurus card. Etali, Primal Storm, 4 generic and 2 red mana. I mean, first of all, just look at the damn thing. Such a cool piece of art. Whenever Etali, Primal Storm attacks, exile the top of each player's library. Then you may cast any number of those spells without paying their mana cost. Let me explain. I have this guy on the field. I'm declaring him as an attacker. And within the rules of the game, whenever you do this, whenever you declare something as an attacker, that counts as it attacking, or it attacks. Whenever I do that, every player on the field, including myself, has to reveal the top card of their deck. And I get to cast any of them for free. And this isn't putting things on the battlefield. Let's say, for example, this guy's effect triggers, I attack, everyone exiles the top card of the library. Exile just means to remove from the game, but in this case, I'm looking outside of the game to cast spells from it. I exile the top card of my deck, and it's Zacama. Now, if you remember, Zacama says, if you cast it, untap all your lands. Because of this guy's effect, I would be casting this guy just for free. That would mean whatever lands cards I have tapped, they untap because I cast it. That's the same thing with all of my opponents. Say my opponents have a really cool card, a big beefy creature that would have killed me the next turn. If they exile it because of this guy's effect, I could say, hey, that shit mine now. Put it on my battlefield and probably spit on it and rub my... Don't spit on people's cards. Just a really powerful card. I love this thing. If I remember correctly, not even that expensive either. So for anyone trying to get into Magic and seeing the estimated cost of my deck, do not let that scare you. You do not have to break the bank in order to play this game, but you will want to. Our next card is a new card from the new expansion, Carnage Tyrant. This is a reprint of an older card. The original looks kind of jank. 4 generic, 2 green, and just like the Tyrranax Rex, it cannot be countered. And it's got Trample and Hexproof, a new keyword here. Hexproof is pretty much a better version of Ward. You know how with Tyrranax Rex, if anyone wants to target this guy with a spell or an ability, they have to pay 4 extra generic mana to do so. With Hexproof, they can't even target this guy, even if they wanted to. It's just a big, strong dinosaur. 7/6. Great card, but a little pricey for what it is. I mean, technically everything's fucking pricey for what it is. These are pieces of cardboard. Golta Primal Hunger. 10 generic mana and 2 green. Give me a freaking break. My commander's already 5 generic mana and you expect me to pay 10 generic? However, this guy's effect here, this spell costs X less to cast, where X is the total power of creatures you control. Let's say I have Carnage Tyrant and my commander on the field at once. Carnage Tyrant's power is at 7. My commander's power is at 7. Total power is 14. That means I'm paying 14 less for this guy, which essentially means for the majority of the time playing this deck, you only cast this guy for 2 green. It's a 12/12 creature, super powerful, and on top of all that, it's got Trample. Whew. One of my favorites in the deck here, we got Majestic Heliopterus for 3 generic and 1 white mana. It has flying. Another returning keyword there. So flying, just to recap, cannot be blocked by non-flying creatures unless they have reach. Whenever this creature attacks, another target dinosaur gains flying until the end of the turn. So first of all, that's such a silly visual. Let's say Golta Primal Hunger is on the field. I declare both of these guys as attackers at the same time. That means I can give this guy flying. So this big-ass T-Rex just sprouts little tiny wings and now he can't be blocked by anyone that doesn't have flying. Just a really good card in general, but on the downside, it is super weak. It's a 2/2 creature, so if I had to block with this guy, if someone else had flying and this was my only option to block with, I would have to give this guy up and he would die immediately. All right, so here is one brand new card here, fresh off the press, Golta Stampede Tyrant. So 5 generic, 3 green. He has Trample. When Golta Stampede Tyrant enters the battlefield, put any number of creature cards from your hand onto the battlefield. Wow. For example, let's say I got some big beefy boys in my hand, but not enough mana to cast all of them. Happens a lot in my deck. In an ideal situation, this is never gonna happen in real life, but just to give you an idea of how this interaction could work. 1 white mana, 1 red mana, 1 green mana, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 generic. I can cast Zacama, and because of the effect that we mentioned before, I casted him for his mana cost. That would mean I untap all of my lands. I have access to 9 mana, and now comes the new card. 3 green and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 generic. I can cast Golta, and this effect triggers. When he enters the battlefield, I put any number of creature cards from my hand onto the battlefield for free. And also because it's the Marauding Raptor and Polyraptor, they would do that infinite, so it does damage to him, spawns a copy, does damage to the copy spawns another copy. That would be amazing. This guy doesn't even have to come from my hand for it to trigger. It just says whenever he enters the battlefield. So that means if I hit with Gishath, he does 7 damage, I reveal 7 cards, boom, 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 free dinos. And if I had creature cards in my hand and he entered the battlefield, I put them on the battlefield as well. To top it all off, he is a 12/12. Our next prehistoric critter, Thrashing Brontodon. 1 generic, 2 green, and I could pay 1 generic and sacrifice this thing to destroy a target artifact or enchantment. It's just a good removal card, is what we call it. Stats aren't the worst either, a 3/4. Alright, here's another potentially salty card just because it has a toxic mechanic again. Tyrranax Atrocity. Shoutouts to Oscar for giving me this one. 3 generic and 2 green. This guy has Haste. Haste and Toxic 3. And stats aren't that bad either, 4-4. But if I were gonna make cuts to the deck, I might cut this one because, maybe I want to move away from playing with poison counters. It's not my main thing. And I've also got a card that deals all the poison damage. Etali, Primal Conqueror. Another one of my favorite cards of this deck. So for 5 generic and 2 red mana, he has Trample. And whenever this guy enters the battlefield, everybody, including myself, exiles the top of their library until they hit a non-land permanent card. To explain what this means, I need to contrast it with Etali Primal Storm. Whenever this guy attacks, everyone exiles the top card of their library, and I can cast any of those spells for free. However, there are plenty of times when a player, or even myself, would exile the top card of their library, and it would just be a land. Now, a land is not a spell. What counts as a spell in the game is anything with a mana cost. If I were to pull a land card from this guy's ability, I can't do anything with this land. It's not a spell I can cast, so this would just stay exiled, which just means I'm never seeing it again. It's out of the game. It's in the garbage. This guy here has that specific caveat there. Each player exiles the top of their library until they hit a non-land permanent. That means each player has to exile the top of their library. Not just one card, but as many as it takes until they hit a non-land permanent, which means I could potentially exile a ton of lands from every opponent's deck. And from any of these non-land permanents, and this is Galta Stampede Tyrant, I can cast any of them for free. Ba-boom. And a non-land permanent doesn't have to just be a creature. It can be an artifact or an enchantment, which we'll get into later. But that is not all. This guy has an activated ability for 9 generic mana and 1 Phyrexian green mana. Now, this is a whole nother mechanic, which just means that you can either pay 1 green mana or 2 life. And that would allow this card to transform into Etali Primal Sickness. Oh, a double-sided card, which makes these sleeves a necessity. This guy has Trample and Indestructible. Oh. It is what it is, man. Indestructible just means that it cannot be destroyed. Even if someone were to somehow do 11 damage to this guy, it would not die. Even if someone cast a spell that says destroy all creatures, it would not die. If you were to fucking burn this card, you would die, but the creature wouldn't. Really, the only way to get rid of this guy would be to exile him, removing him from the game entirely, which some cards are able to do that. Some of my cards are able to do that, actually. Or to bounce this guy back into my hand, in which case this guy would transform back into its first mode, I'm pretty sure. But anyway, whenever Etali Primal Sickness does combat damage to a player, they get that many poison counters. And this card has a little piece of reminder text telling you that if a player has 10 poison counters, they lose. And to top it all off, this guy has 11 power. So if this guy were to go unchallenged, unblocked, target opponent would die. That's it. Even if they were at 40 health, they would get 11 poison counters because this guy does 11 damage and they only need 10 to die. It's overkill. I love this card, and I suppose that fulfills my transformation quota for a jObBy video. I hope you guys are getting as excited for these things as I am. If not, well, I'm glad to tell you that you are normal. Our next card I actually did get for free. Shoutouts to Omar, who's no longer a dirty rat. Apex Altasaur, 7 generic and 2 green. Whenever Apex Altasaur enters the battlefield, it fights up to 1 target creature you don't control. So this was a confusing aspect of Magic that I had to wrap my brain around. Attacking is not the same as fighting. Let me explain. An attacking creature would be in this scenario where I'm sending this guy off to a certain player and I declare it as an attacker. This would be an attacking creature. Fighting, it's pretty much a way of fighting a creature without having to target that creature's controller. So let's say I casted this guy or I put him on the battlefield for free and someone has an Etali Primal Storm. Even if it's not the combat phase, I can be like, this guy will fight this guy. That means they're forced to duke it out the same way as if the opponent were to declare this guy as a blocker. They deal their damage at the same time. In this interaction, this guy would lose because this guy hits for 10 power and he's got 10 toughness as well. So you have to do 10 damage in order to kill this guy. Now, where this gets really neat, the Enrage ability. Whenever Apex Altasaur is dealt damage, it fights up to one target creature you don't control. Let's say an opponent has 10 1/1 creatures, and I cast this guy. Whenever he enters the battlefield, I can have him fight a target creature that I don't control. I go for 1/1/1. That 1/1 creature is gonna deal 1 damage to my guy, which obviously won't kill it, but damage is damage, so that means he fights another target creature that I don't control. Let's go for another 1/1. That 1/1 will deal 1 damage to this guy, and it won't do anything. Essentially, this is a wipe. I can chain a series of fights until a whole board is gone. He has to fight until either all creatures are gone or he dies, because he has 10 health after all. It's a lot of health, but it is not infinite. Let's move on to another new card. Hulking Raptor. For 2 generic and 2 green, it's got Ward 2, and this guy says, at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, add 2 green mana. So what that means is that if this guy's on the field and it's before we go into combat, I would just have an extra 2 green mana to play with. Which means, potentially, on turn 4, I can say that I use the 2 green mana that this guy produces. 1 white, 1 red, 4 generic. My commander could come out on turn 4. Just a great card. Another piece of ramp. Has pretty good stats too. 5 power, 3 generic, would synergize really well with Godzilla. I'm glad this is a card that exists now. And on the topic of cards that I'm glad about, this is another favorite at the table. Quartzwood Crasher. For 2 generic, 2 red, and 1 green. This guy's got Trample, and he has. Whenever 1 or more creatures you control with Trample deal combat damage to a player, create an XX green dinosaur beast creature token with Trample, where X is that amount of damage of those creatures dealt to that player. Bit of a word salad, but the effect is quite simple, I assure you. I'm telling you, I never thought I'd be able to get into trading card games because they seemed too complex, but if I could do it, anyone could do it. My brain is the size of an acorn, which coincidentally is the size of dinosaur brains. Anyway, let's say I have these 3 on board. So this guy, Commander, Atali, Primal Conqueror. I attack with all of them, and if the opponent I'm sending these guys after does not block these creatures, they would do a total of 6 plus 7 plus 7. 20 damage. And because all of these guys have Trample, this guy is going to poop out a dinosaur beast token with XX power toughness, where X is the total amount of combat damage done to a player by trampling creatures. And he would be at 2020. Does that make sense? Why am I even asking that question at this point? Thank you for being along for the ride. If I decide to full send an army of dinosaurs to a player, the dinosaur beast token that would be generated from all that combat damage, it could be potentially in the hundreds. I don't always have to be attacking one player. I can split my damage to multiple players. Say my Gishath attacks one guy, that would create 1 dinosaur beast token with 7/7 because this guy does 7 combat damage. Attack with this guy, I would get another dinosaur beast token with 6/6 because this guy does 6 damage. You get the idea. All right, so our next dinosaur is just a cheapy one, but a pretty big threat early game. A giant Cindermaw. Big old George Lucas neck there for 2 generic and 1 red mana. And he just has Trample, and it just says players can't gain life. While this is not the strongest card ever, it's a 4/3. It is extremely cheap to cast, so good value, but it also shuts down any sort of life gain strategies. Kind of underrated. Trample's always nice too. Here we have another new one from the Lost Caverns of Ixalan. We have Earthshaker Dreadmaw. For 4 generic, 2 green, Trample. When this creature enters the battlefield, draw a card for each other dinosaur you control. If I had a lot of dinosaurs on the field and this guy comes into play, I would be drawing that many cards. Extremely good draw power. However, you gotta be careful with this guy. The maximum hand size is 7. So if you had 7 cards in your hand already, and this guy came down and you had 7 dinosaurs on the field, you would be drawing 7 cards. Now that wouldn't be a problem if you have an effect that says you don't have a maximum hand size or you have enough mana to cast everything from your hand. But if you don't use all those cards before the end of the turn, you're gonna have to put 7 cards in the graveyard. But with all the potential drawbacks, he's still a 6/6 creature, so definitely worth still having. Ooh, our next card. Another potentially salty one. Kinjali Sunwing for 2 generic and 1 1 white mana, and it's got flying. Creatures your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped, which means they can't do shit. Even if they had haste, they can't attack, they can't block because they're tapped. Ooh! Our next one is another one from the new Ixalan set, Pugnacious Hammerskull. 2 generic and green. Whenever Pugnacious Hammerskull attacks while you don't control another dinosaur, put a stun counter on it. If a permanent with a stun counter would become untapped, remove 1 from it instead. If I were to attack with this guy and I don't have anything else on the field, no dinosaurs, the attack would go through, and this is a super strong card. Look at that, it's a 6/6. However, there is a major setback to this card. So at the beginning of each of your turns, you get to untap everything that you tapped in your previous turn. However, with this guy's effect, it doesn't get untapped. Instead, I would just remove a stun counter and then it would untap on its next turn. However, because of the nature of my deck, the ideal situation being a lot of dinosaurs on the field, I don't see the whole stun thing as a huge setback. And our next card you saw for 1 second, Regisaur Alpha. 3 generic, 1 red, 1 green. Other dinosaurs you control have haste. And not only that, whenever this guy enters the battlefield, I create a token. And it would be just one of these, a 3/3 dinosaur token. And because of this guy's effect, this guy would not have summoning sickness. It could attack immediately. A little bit on the smaller side being a 4/4 creature, but just really good to include. Our next card, Wakening Sun's Avatar. 5 generic and 3 white mana. When Wakening Sun's Avatar enters the battlefield, if you cast it from your hand, destroy all non-dinosaur creatures. Ooh. The drawbacks to this particular card is that the situation is super specific. If you cast it from your hand, that's when it would destroy all non-dinosaur creatures. That means with my commander's effect, if I put this on the battlefield for free, it won't do anything. Also, this wouldn't work with my Itali Primal Conqueror either, because that one, I'm casting it from exile, not from my hand. I include this just in case, and worst case scenario, it's still a 7/7 creature. Also, God forbid, it would wipe out my companion, because unfortunately, the companion is not a dinosaur. It sounds really good, but not the best. But what is the best? This card is stupid. Zetalpa, Primal Dawn. 6 generic and 2 white. It pretty much has all the effects. Look at this. I mean, it's got flying. It's got trample. It's got double strike. All right. So let's say an opponent has a hulking raptor. It's a 5/3 creature. And I go ahead and attack with Zetalpa Primal Dawn. And my opponent is blocking with this guy. In a normal combat scenario, these guys would deal damage to each other at the same time. If that were the case, this guy would still die, and this guy would receive 5 damage because this guy has 5 power. However, because this guy has double strike, the first strike of that double strike would just go through. It would do damage before this guy does. It would die before this guy received any damage at all. And then where does that regular combat damage go? Well, if the creature with double strike doesn't have trample, it goes nowhere. The attack just fumbles like normal. However, because this guy does have trample, normal combat damage just goes straight to the controller, so 4 damage. But if this guy were to attack unopposed, it would do 4 damage 2 times. 8 damage total. Amazing. But that ain't all. It's got vigilance and indestructible. What the fuck is this card? Amazing. I don't know why this card is so cheap, which just goes to show you, you don't need to break the bank to get good cards. Our next creature, Silverclad Ferocidons, for 5 generic mana and 2 red mana, 7 total mana value. And this one also has an enrage ability. Whenever this guy is dealt damage, each opponent sacrifices a permanent. Let me explain to you how good that is. Let's bring back our old friend, the Marauding Raptor. Now, if you remember this guy's effect, he's gonna do 2 damage to this guy, which is not enough to kill him because this guy has 5 toughness. Whenever this guy's dealt damage, each opponent sacrifices a permanent. If this interaction happens when the majority of people have like 1 creature on board and they don't want to sacrifice a land, well, they have to say bye-bye to those creatures. I am so excited to talk about our last 2 creatures. Godzilla Doom Inevitable, also known as Shin Godzilla. It is a reprint of an existing card, but that original artwork, forget about it, man. Look at this thing. 5 generic mana and 2 red mana. You get a dinosaur turtle, whatever. It's got Trample, it's got Haste, and it has another ability called Cycling for 1 generic and 1 red mana. When you cycle Yidaro Wandering Monster, aka Godzilla Doom Inevitable, shuffle it into your library from your graveyard. If you cycled a card named Yidaro Wandering Monster 4 or more times the game, put it onto the battlefield from your graveyard instead. Let's say that on your opening hand or on your first few turns, you pull this guy. Most likely, you are not gonna have the mana to cast them. You have the option of paying the cycling cost. And what cycling means, discard a card. So that means just to put the card in your graveyard and draw a new card. However, because of this guy's effect, it doesn't stay in the graveyard. You shuffle it into your deck. And if you do that 4 times, instead of going back into your library, it just goes onto the battlefield for free. It's not the most crazy card mechanically. I mean, that would go to Zacama Primal Dawn. Keyword soup. It just feels really nice to say Godzilla is on the field. And now for our final creature, another Godzilla. And this one is Godzilla Primeval Champion. Big mana cost here, 7 generic and 2 green mana. And it is another reskin of an existing card, but again, why have that when you can have this? And this guy has Trample, and it also has Cycling, just like Shin Godzilla. You can pay 1 generic and 1 green to discard this card, draw another card, right? But whenever you do, you can put a Trample counter on another target creature. So it could pretty much act as a buff to another creature without Trample, but since we're playing dinosaurs, a lot of them already have Trample, so I consider this cycling ability to be useless in this deck. My goal is to just get this guy out for free. We can do with our commander or with one of our artifacts, which is what we're gonna get into next. I've only got 4 in this deck. Some artifacts tap for mana, which is really good for ramping up. The classic, the ever-present Soul Ring. For just 1 generic mana, you get an artifact that can tap for 2 generic mana. A really great turn 1 move. We have our Manifold Key for 1 generic mana, and this artifact has activated abilities. That first activated ability to pay 1 generic mana and tap this artifact to untap another artifact, that's not the effect that I'm concerned about. For the cost of 3 generic mana and tapping this card, I can make a target creature unblockable. You could imagine who I'd use that effect on. And now for our last 2 artifacts, some pretty financially pricey cards. Urza's Incubator. For 3 generic mana, as this thing is entering the battlefield, I choose a creature type. In my case, of course, I'm gonna choose dinosaurs. What, are you stupid? Because of that, all my dinosaur creature spells would cost 2 less to cast. Instead of casting my commander for a total of 8 mana value, I would only be casting this for 6. Beautiful card, but was it beautiful enough? Yes. Next card, Monster Manual. 3 generic and 1 green. It's a crazy looking card because it's got 2 sides to it. So essentially, you can cast this card as a sorcery, which I really don't care about this effect at all. I only use this thing for its second effect. 1 generic, 1 green mana, tap this artifact, and you could just put a creature from your hand onto the battlefield for free. Well, technically, it's not free. You're paying 2 mana. If I had a Volta, Stampede, Tyrant, and a bunch of other creature cards in my hand that I can't pay for, 1 generic, 1 green, tap this artifact, bring out Galta, bring out all my creatures. Come on, man. So that's all my artifacts. Magic veterans probably wondering where my Commander Sphere or Arcane Signet is. And let me tell you. Let's get into our sorceries, which I actually have quite a few of them. 11 in total. These are spells that you could cast only during any of your main phases. A turn in Magic consists of your untap step, your upkeep. The upkeep is just this weird in-between phase between your untap and your draw. Untap, upkeep, draw. After that, the main phase begins. A sorcery spell is just a spell that you could only cast on your main phase, and after you cast it, it goes into your graveyard. So it's kind of a one-use thing. And you can cast a sorcery spell on any of your main phases. You get 2, pre-combat main phase, combat, and then after that, you get a second main phase sorcery. The first one that I'm going to talk about, Blasphemous Act. It costs 8 generic mana and 1 red mana, which is a pretty steep cost, but that effect there, this spell costs 1 less to cast for each creature on the battlefield. If there are 8 creatures on the battlefield, doesn't matter if they're mine or my opponent's, this will cost that much less to cast. And it's called Blasphemous Act for a reason. It says Blasphemous Act deals 13 damage to each creature. It doesn't say your opponent's creatures, it's everything. This is a panic button. You only cast this if you're falling behind. If everyone else at the table has a big board state, you want to cast Blasphemous Act to get rid of everything. However, it does specify that it only does 13 damage to each creature, so God forbid if a creature from your opponent's side has more than 13 toughness, this would not kill it. The rest of my sorcery cards are all about that concept of ramp. And just to remind you, with ramp cards, I'm able to play extra lands per turn. So the first two here, we have Migration Path and Circuitous Route. Both of them cost 3 generic and 1 green mana, and both of them allow you to search your library for 2 basic land cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. Which means 4 mana on turn 4, I'd be able to tap 1 green, 1, 2, 3 generic to cast Circuitous Route, and that would allow me to search my library for 2 basic land cards. Again, this is what a basic land card looks like. They don't always look like that though. Sometimes basic lands are fancy, but basic lands are just lands that tap for 1 color of mana. I can search for 2 of them though. So that would mean rather than playing 1 land for this turn, I would have played 3, which is a great boost. Helps me get to my goal faster. I just have to race to Gishath, and after that, Gishath will do the rest. The only difference between these two are really minor. I mean, Circuitous Route, it allows you to look for gate cards as well, which I don't run in my deck. And Migration Path, it also has a cycling feature, paying 2 generic to discard this card and draw a card. That's really helpful if you pull this late game and you don't need the ramp anymore. This one should have been talked about at the same time because it does the same exact thing. Explosive Vegetation even costs the same as well. 3 cards that do the same thing. We have another one called Explore for 1 generic and 1 green. You may play an additional land this turn. So again, circumventing that 1 land per turn rule, and you get to draw a card. Cultivate and Kodama's Reach. These 2 cards do the exact same thing. They even cost the same as well. 2 generic, 1 green. Search your library for up to 2 basic land cards. Reveal those cards. Put 1 onto the battlefield tapped and the other into your hand, then shuffle. You only get to put 1 onto the battlefield tapped and another one into your hand. Still really good. That just means you have another land to play on your next turn. Sometimes you do not draw land. Again, no land, no game, no life, which I'm all too familiar with at this point. Oh, here's one of my favorite ramp spells here. Search for Tomorrow. It costs 2 generic and 1 green. Search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. If you notice in those previous cards, they allow you to put a land onto the battlefield but tapped, which means that you can't use that land on the same turn that you casted those ramp spells. This card, however, doesn't have that stipulation. You can get a basic land card and use that land immediately. Very good. But that's not my favorite part about this card. It has an alternative suspend cost. It says suspend 2. I could pay 1 green mana as opposed to 1 green mana plus 2 generic mana to suspend this card. And what that means, instead of it coming into effect immediately, you exile it. And again, exile usually means that it's out of the game. You'll never see it again. It's in the garbage. In this case, though, it's an exile with 2 time counters. Say I casted this on turn 1 for its suspension cost. Turn 2, untap, upkeep. This is that phase, right? Before the draw phase, during my upkeep, I can remove a time counter from this card and then draw. The next turn, other counter would go away and I would cast this without paying for it. And when I cast it, it goes into the graveyard. Oh, ironically, I don't have the card Rampant Growth in here, which I assume the term ramp comes from. I do, however, have what is essentially a dinosaur-themed version of that card. Thunderherd Migration for 1 generic, 1 green, but as an additional cost to cast this spell, I have to reveal a dinosaur card from my hand. Search my library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield tap, then shuffle. Okay, these are some of the best ramp spells that you can get. 3 visits, 1 generic, 1 green. Search your library for a forest card, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. You notice that it doesn't come in tapped. That means if you cast this spell, you can put a forest card, which is just a green basic land card, taps for green mana, put it onto your battlefield. You can use it immediately. And this card, Nature's Lore, does the same exact thing. There's literally no difference. Sometimes you can combo ramp into each other. Say you got both of these cards in your hand. One generic, one green mana, and you could play 3 visits, search your library for a forest card, put it onto the battlefield, doesn't enter tapped, and that means you still have extra mana. Play Nature's Lore, search your library for a forest card, put that onto the battlefield. You'll still have 2 mana to work with. In which case, you can cast our next spell, Farseek. 1 generic mana, 1 green mana. And this card allows you to search your library for a plains, island, swamp, or mountain card, put it onto the battlefield tap, then shuffle. Pretty much anything that's not a forest. And to clarify something, all those types of lands, they don't have to be basics like these. I mean, I'll get into the lands when we get to them. There are some lands that are non-basic, but they still count as a forest or what have you. It just depends on what it says on the card. We'll get into it later. Our final sorcery and final ramp spell has gotta be the best. Sky Shroud Claim, 3 generic mana, 1 green mana. It allows you to search your library for 2 forest cards, put them onto the battlefield, then shuffle. And they don't come in tapped. You can use them immediately. Excellent card. It's pricey for a reason. With all of these cards working in tandem, hopefully, I can cast Gishath earlier than he should be cast. So that is the concept of ramp. But land ramp is not the only ramp there is. And let me talk about a particular card that is, I suppose it's considered one of the saltier cards in the entirety of Magic. And you'll see why when we get into our enchantments. The ultimate ramp spell, Smothering Tithe, for 3 generic and 1 white mana. Whenever an opponent draws a card, they may pay 2 generic mana. If they do not, I create a treasure token. And a treasure is just an artifact that you can tap for mana of any color. And remember, every turn, you draw a card. So whenever they draw a card, I have to be on it. Do you pay 2 mana? 9 out of 10, they're not gonna pay because they need their mana to do other stuff on their turn. Of course, mana's valuable in this game. Why would they pay 2 mana to stop me doing this? Well, there is a good reason why they would stop me doing this, because if I get enough treasures, I can cast Gishath on turn 4. It's insane. But on the downside, like everything else in the game, this is vulnerable to being destroyed. You saw it for yourself. There's a lot of dinosaurs that can destroy enchantments or artifacts. If an opponent had this is one that I would want to get rid of. Our next one here, Duelist Heritage, for 2 generic mana, 1 white mana. Whenever 1 or more creatures attack, I can give a target creature double strike until the end of the turn. Now, we already talked about double strike. You hit twice. That's really good for my commander. If it hits 1 time, that's 7 cards that I reveal, put any dinosaur cards on the battlefield, and it hits a 2nd time, that's 7 more cards that I reveal, put dinosaurs on the battlefield. This card can get nuts. But a really fun thing about this card, it doesn't say creatures I control. It doesn't specify that. That means if someone else is attacking someone else, I can give that creature double strike. Really great enchantment. Our next one here, really nice theming with the dinosaurs, Garruk's Uprising. 2 generic, 1 green, gives all of your creatures trample, and when it enters the battlefield, if I control a creature with power 4 or greater, for example, my commander, I draw a card. It also says that whenever another creature with power 4 or greater enters the field, when this thing is on the field, you draw more cards. So depending on how many dinosaurs come out into play, and most of them are over 4 power, I'm gonna be drawing a shit ton of cards. All right, our next one, I believe it's a brand new one from the new expansion, Growing Rights of Itlimok. It's 2 generic and 1 green. When Growing Rights of Itlimok enters the battlefield, look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest to the bottom of your library in any order. Let's say this comes on the field. That means I get to reveal 1, 2, 3, 4 cards from the top of my library. And among those cards, if any of them are creature cards, which in this case they're all lands, I would be able to put a creature card into my hand. And the rest of them would go to the bottom. Just a good way to get through your deck. But the best part, at the beginning of your end step, right when you say that you end your turn, if you control 4 or more creatures, transform. Growing Rights of Itlimok. Itlimok, Cradle of the Sun. It's a land. It can tap for green mana, but it can also tap for 1 green mana per creature you control. Depending on how much creatures I control, which can get upwards up to 10 creatures on the board, that is an insane amount of green mana. And our last enchantment, Certified Hood Classic, Rhythm of the Wild. 1 generic, 1 red, 1 green. Creature spells can't be countered. I already talked about how boo bitches can counter your big beefy creatures. Not in this case. If this thing is on the field, your creature spells, all of them, cannot be countered, and your creatures enter the battlefield with your choice of a +1/+1 counter, which is a buff, or haste. This card is fantastic. Before we get into our lands, we are going to be talking about our instants. Again, to remind you, instants are spells that you can cast at any time, including on your opponent's turns. For the first one is the one that I brought up before, Blessed Respite. 1 generic, 1 green. You get to shuffle your graveyard into your library and prevent all combat damage. If a lot of shit died, they'll come back to your deck immediately. But notice it says target player. Doesn't have to be you. I guess if you want to help your opponents, you could target your opponent to shuffle their graveyard. We have Swords to Plowshares for just 1 white mana. Exile a target creature, and that controller gains life equal to that exile creature's power. It might sound counterintuitive to exile an opponent's creature, and then they would get life back. Well, if the creature was stupid and big enough to kill me in a pinch, just 1 white mana, just exile that thing. I don't give a shit at that point if the controller gains a bunch of life. With my deck, with all the dinosaurs that I have, that life total could go down really quickly. And another removal spell is what we call it. Path to Exile. Pretty much the same thing as Swords to Plowshares. You exile a target creature, but instead of the controller of the creature gaining life, they get to search their library for a basic land card, put onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. This one is really good, but it could unintentionally give your opponent an advantage. Or you can exile your own creature and get yourself a free basic land. So there's ways to play it. The rest of my instants are for the sake of protection. I run 4. The first one here is called Make a Stand. 2 generic, 1 white mana. Creatures you control get +1/+0 and indestructible until the end of the turn. If an opponent is saying destroy all creatures, I could just tap all that and say, nah, everyone else's creatures might be going away, but not mine. And my other protection spell here does the same thing, gives my creatures indestructible until the end of the turn, but it also has an addendum effect, which means if I cast it during one of my main phases, not during one of my opponent's turns, my creatures get a +1/+1 counter and vigilance until the end of the turn. Problem with these protection spells, though, is that they're kind of pricey to cast, but for our last 2 instants, we have 2 mana protection spells. Boros Charm, 1 red, 1 white mana. I can either deal 4 damage to target player or planeswalker, which we're not even going to get into tonight, don't even ask. Permanents I control gain indestructible until the end of the turn, so this doesn't even just protect creatures, everything on my board. My enchantments, my artifacts, my land. The third option is to give a target creature double strike until the end of the turn. All good options on this card. For the last protection spell, my favorite and the most expensive. 1 generic, 1 green for Heroic Intervention. Permanents I control get hexproof and indestructible until the end of the turn. Excellent card. Well worth the money. That is all of my spells. So now I want to talk about my mana base. 38 lands. The biggest pile of my lands here, your forests. And I even got 2 cool looking lands from the new set. 17 forests. And for the other 2 basic land types that I run here are my mountains, which produce red mana, and my plains, which produce white mana. Super happy that I pulled this from the new set, and it looks so good, but it's only a land. Those are all the basics, but because we are a 3-color deck, we run quite a few non-basic lands, which in most cases produce multiple colors of mana per land. Cinderglade can produce 1 red mana or 1 green mana. A really cool thing about this card is that it counts as both a mountain and a forest. So if I were to cast Farseek, it allows me to look through my library for a mountain card, right? Sure, I can just look for this beautiful Jurassic Park mountain card, or I can leave myself some options and look for this card because it counts as a mountain. Same thing with this card. Canopy Vista counts as both a forest and a plains. So I can look for that card with this card, or I can look for it with Sky Shroud Claim, and it will come in untapped as long as I control 2 or more basic lands. I did my best to avoid any lands that come in tapped, because if they come in tapped, that's essentially wasting a turn to wait for it to untap so you can use it. At least with lands like these where it enters tapped unless it hits a certain requirement, those are fine. However, there are some lands that were worth keeping that enter tapped, like Jungle Shrine. It does enter tapped, but once it untaps on your next turn, it can produce red, green, or white mana. This one as well. Trosan Verge. It does enter the battlefield tapped, and once it untaps, you can only tap it for generic mana. However, it has that second ability. If I had 2 other lands on the field, I can pay 2 generic mana, tap this, and sacrifice it to search for a forest card and a plains card to put them onto the battlefield tap. So it's a ramp spell, but a land. Excellent. I don't know what to call these types of lands, but they're usually gold bordered. Exotic Orchard. It just taps for any colored mana that an opponent's land could produce. This works really well if I'm short on white mana and I'm playing against a white player. In order to check their white privilege, I steal their white mana. Path of Ancestry. This enters the battlefield tapped, but it does come with a nice perk where it can produce any color in your commander's color identity, and you can use that mana for anything. Also, the added benefit, if you cast a creature spell with this mana that shares a creature type with your commander, which in my case I will be because all of my creatures are dinosaurs, I get to scry 1. Yet another mechanic of the game. Scrying. Let's say that I use this mana to summon a dinosaur. Scrying 1, I get to look at the top card of my deck. And with this knowledge of the top card of my deck, I can either leave it so I can draw it next turn, or I can put it at the bottom of my deck so that we get through the deck quickly to get to what I need. Unclaimed Territory. And as it enters, choose a creature type. Of course, I'm going to choose dinosaurs. And it can either tap for generic mana or any mana of any color, but I can only use that mana to cast my creature type. Here's a staple of Commander that you really need in your deck if you don't run it already. Command Tower. It just produces any color of your commander's color identity, and that's that. For our final 2 lands here, I suppose this is what you would call utility lands. Lands that do something other than produce mana. Ghost Quarter. I talked about it before. It can tap for colorless mana, or you can tap it and sacrifice it to destroy a target land. And our final land, Rogue's Passage, one of my favorite cards. Again, it could tap for colorless mana, or you can pay 4 generic mana, so that's 4 mana of any color, tap this thing, and make a target creature unblockable. Combine that with Double Strike with my commander? Come on, dude. Freaking epic. Well, that was the entirety of my deck tech. I mean, I was planning to do coverage of my sideboard, but that could be its own video at this point. I mean, I've got a bunch of cards that I would love to include in this deck, but just didn't really make the cut. But basically, that is the nature of the deck, and that is the video. I hope you guys had a lot of fun. If you liked the video, leave a like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel for more potential Magic content if you like this video enough. And of course, more toy reviews.
But jObBy, where are the Transformers?
I'm over here playing children's card games when there's just so much shit that I gotta take a look at.